Good evening and welcome to our third installment of the Myths and Facts series. Tonight we're going to be discussing the very important mitzvah of Tevilat Keilim, of taking our kitchen utensils, our pots, pans, forks, knives, and other cooking items, and immersing them, being tovel them in the mikveh before use. We're going to discuss three areas of this very important topic. We're going to discuss the why, the how, and the what, and hopefully in the process we will clarify and explain some of the overarching principles as well as some common misconceptions. So when it comes to the why, we have to start in the Chumash. The Chumash at the end of Parshas Matos tells us that there was an episode where the Jewish soldiers fought the Midianites, and after the battle, they took spoils from war. So the Torah tells us that some of those spoils included various utensils. So says the Chumash, these utensils, of course, they were used by non-Jewish families, and therefore probably or possibly would have absorption within the walls of these utensils from non-Jewish items. So of course, these items have to be koshered, right? They have to be, depending on how they were used, they would have to be koshered in a various process. This is not the topic for tonight, but the Torah tells us that in addition to this koshering process, in addition to removing the absorbed taste from non-kosher items, there's another requirement. Even if these vessels were brand new and never used before, there's another requirement that because these vessels were under the ownership of non-Jews, so there is an additional mitzvah to take these vessels and add a level of purity to them, to take them to the mikveh and immerse them in the mikveh. Some of the commentaries actually view this additional level of purity or purification that's taking place with these vessels as a sort of conversion. That's in a similar way that if a person wants to join the Jewish religion, one of the components of that process is going to a mikveh and immersing in a ritual bath. So too, when a vessel is being taken from non-Jewish ownership and being acquired by a Jew, in this case it was through war, but in our cases it's by purchasing it in a store. Most of the time, the vessels that we're purchasing in a store were not under Jewish ownership prior to our acquisition. And so when we acquire them and bring them into our kitchen, so we, so to speak, inaugurate them and give them this extra level of purity, of Kedusha, by putting them into the mikveh. Now that we know the why, let's discuss a little bit just about the how. So there is a very important principle that when any vessel is brought to the mikveh, when it's immersed when it's being toveled in the mikveh, so it has to be that the vessel is fully submerged in the water at one time without any impediments blocking water from coming into contact with any part of the vessel. So before going to the mikveh, it's very important to take our handy-dandy gugan, because often when you purchase an item, it'll have a sticker on the item that has the price or has the manufacturing information, whatever other information. So we're going to tear off the sticker, and then sometimes when you tear off the sticker, there's a little bit of a residue that's left. So that residue can be easily removed with gugan and a paper towel. So you should clean the item extremely well to make sure that there is nothing blocking any part of the surface area of that utensil, and then take it to the mikveh. Now when we take it to the mikveh, we have to fully submerge it under the water. Now we have to obviously be careful, because if we're holding it, so then our hand will actually be touching part of the utensil and be blocking some of the water from getting into contact with that part. So we have to be a little bit nimble, and we have to put it into the mikveh and let go for a second and catch it, because we obviously don't want it to fall to the bottom. Sometimes at the mikveh you'll notice that there are large baskets, that have many holes so the water can flow freely within the basket. So sometimes the baskets can be helpful to drop the utensil into the basket. The basket will catch the utensil before the utensil falls to the bottom of the basket. It will obviously be fully submerged and surrounded by the water in the mikveh. However, it is also important to realize that many times when people are newly married and they have many new utensils to bring into their kitchen, so they go to the mikveh and they spend many hours being toveling all of their utensils. So one way to make this process go a little bit faster is to tovel more than one thing at a time. You have a basket, so you take the basket, you fill it up with utensils, and you submerge the whole thing in the mikveh. Now, it is possible to submerge and to be tovel many keilim, many utensils at once. However, one has to be very careful that if you pile up too many things at one time, so then the utensils themselves will be crowded and touching one another, and when they're in the mikveh, it will not necessarily be the case that water will be able to come into contact with all parts of all of the vessels, all of the utensils. So therefore, while it is permissible to do more than one at a time, one should be extremely careful that each utensil is fully submerged and that the water comes into contact fully with the entire utensil all at one period in time, and that there's nothing blocking it for any reason, be it your hand, be it anything that's stuck to the surface of the utensil, or being it because utensils of the Keilim are all piled up too closely one on top of the other, that there is not a possibility for water to get in between all of the various utensils. So that is a little bit about the how the Tevilah actually is done, and we will talk about shortly that when the Tevilah is done, because this is a mitzvah, like all mitzvos, it is necessary to recite a bracha before the actual action of performing the mitzvah. So too, when it comes to Tevilas Keilim, before we would actually put the utensil in the mikvah, before we would be tovel the kli, so we would also recite the bracha that is usually posted on the wall in your local Keilim mikvah. We'll see that some items do require bracha, some don't require bracha. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next few minutes. Now that we've discussed some of the why and some of the how, let's get to the real nitty-gritty in terms of the what. So we mentioned that the Torah already tells us that there's a mitzvah to be tovel kelim. There's a mitzvah to take these utensils and put them into the mikvah. So the Torah mentions that this is a mitzvah that is applicable to metal vessels. So for example, this metal ladle is made out of probably stainless steel. So this requires tevilah on a biblical level and would require a bracha before immersing it into the mikvah. What about something that is not mentioned in the Torah? The Torah mentions 6 types of metals, but what about if you have something like a glass kli? If you have a glass kli, a glass bowl, for example, so the Torah doesn't mention anything about this. The Gemara tells us, though, that because glass has similar qualities to metal, that just like metal, if it is heated up to being boiling hot, it can be molded and shaped, and if there was a hole, the hole could be mended. So too, glass is also made through a process and can be corrected through a process of glass blowing, through a process of intense heat. And so too, just like the metal has a requirement of tevilah, so too a glass bowl would also have a requirement of tevilah, albeit not on a biblical level. It is not mentioned in the Chumash as one of the items or one of the materials that requires tevilah, but Chazal come along and tell us that glass would also require tevilah, not on a biblical level, but on a rabbinic level. Now there is a common misconception that because the glass is not included in the mitzvah on a biblical level, that therefore when one takes it to the mikvah and puts it into the mikvah, it does not require a bracha. The truth is that this misconception, would be an example of a myth, that the glass does not require a bracha before the tevilah, before the immersion, because we may be familiar with many other examples of mitzvos midrabanan that we perform throughout the year, and mitzvos midrabanan, of course, have a bracha recited before their performance. For example, we light Hanukkah candles. Hanukkah candles is not a mitzvah midaraisa. Nowhere in the Torah does it tell us that we're required to light Hanukkah candles, and nonetheless, we know that before we light our Hanukkah candles, we do recite a bracha. So the fact that the glass is only required to be brought to the mikvah on a rabbinic level does not mean that it should not have a bracha. It definitely gets a bracha before the immersion. Now there are some types of things that require no bracha whatsoever. So that would be something like plastic. Plastic does not require any bracha whatsoever because it is modeled after the category in the Torah of things that are not relevant to the laws or not subject to the laws of purity and impurity, of tumah v'tahara. So just like, for example, earthenware, a clay vessel or a vessel made out of china, made out of ceramics or clay, does not require tevilah. So too, plastic does not require tevilah. Now it is a question when it comes to our china, because our china is made out of ceramic material, but our china also has a very pretty, very nice, smooth glaze that is covering the china. Usually the glaze is made out of some sort of glass type of material. And the glaze is there to add a little bit of an extra shine and to preserve whatever designs might be inlaid or color that might be inlaid in the actual china. So our china, even though it's essence is that it's, of course, made out of ceramic. Because it has this glass covering, there is a question whether or not that glass covering will transform the kli, will transform the utensil to be one that does require tevilah. So this is a big machlokas amongst the poskim, and there are definitely various opinions on this matter. The opinion of Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Soloveitchik is that china, in essence, is a ceramic dish. The fact that it has a very thin layer of glass on the outside, it makes it pretty and it might make it smoother, but it doesn't, and it might preserve the design or the color, but it does not actually change the essence of the bowl or of the plate of the utensil, and therefore the utensil remains one that is, in essence, made out of ceramic, and ceramic does not require, tevilah does not have to be brought to the mikvah. Other poskim disagree and think that because the outside is covered with a material that does require tevilah, this glass glaze, that even though the inside of the kli is not glass and is ceramic and is putter, it does not require tevilah, because the part that comes into contact with the food that is really used to service the food is a material that does require tevilah, so therefore it would be required to take the china to the mikvah. However, even these poskim who assume against Rav Moshe and against the Rav from Soloveitchik that there is a requirement of tefillah on china, they agree that there should be no bracha recited when that tefillah is done. One thing that gets a little bit exciting is what if you have a hybrid vessel? What if you have a hybrid kli? So for example, take a look at this spoon. This spoon has two parts to it. This spoon has the metal components and also some sort of plastic or other type of material that is connected, that is used as the handle. You also could have a hybrid, which is a little different type of a hybrid. If you take, for example, this set of tongs. This set of tongs is a metal set of tongs that has some sort of silicone covering that covers the edges so that when it is used for the food, the metal components will not scratch the surface of whatever pot or whatever pan that you're using, and will maintain the quality of the pot. So these two things, I guess we could call them types of hybrid keilim that have different components. Some components require tevilah. The metal obviously requires tevilah, but the plastic or the other material that's being used is a material that does not require plastic. So what is the halacha in keilim such as this? So the truth is that it depends. So let's take, for example, this spoon. This spoon, the part that comes into there, it's two distinct parts. There's the metal part and there's the plastic parts. If you have a kli, a vessel, a utensil that has two distinct parts, so then you have to ask one question. The question is, which part comes into contact with the food, and what is that part, what is that component made out of? So in this case, the part that comes into contact with the food is obviously the end here that has the receptacle for the spoon. So the spoon is made out of metal. So since metal is a material that requires tevilah, this spoon, even though half of the spoon is not metal and does not require tevilah, because the part that comes into contact with the food, either as serving or as eating, or for eating, is metal and does require tevilah, so therefore the entire kli would require tevilah. If it was reversed, so then the plastic part that would be the part that comes into contact with the food, and the metal part would be the part that was simply used as the handle, so then this kli would not require tevilah whatsoever. But when it comes to a kli, which is a full kli, it's a fully formed, the base is a fully formed utensil, like this metal set of tongs. So if you look carefully underneath the plastic, there is metal. The plastic does not move very easily. The plastic is clearly, or the silicone rubber material is clearly covering just the metal base. So the entire kli is metal. So therefore, many poskim assume that even though the part that comes into contact with the food is plastic and would not require tevilah, because it's just covering a metal kli, and the kli in its entirety is a fully functional kli and is made out of metal, this kli does require tevilah, albeit without a bracha. You have a similar question when it comes to baby spoons. Baby spoons often have a little plastic covering that covers the tip of the spoon, the part that comes into contact with the food, and even though plastic does not require tevilah, and that's the part that comes into contact with the food, it would still require to be taken to the mikvah, because underneath the plastic there is the base of the metal spoon, and a metal spoon would require tevilah. A big question arises when it comes to electronic appliances. So here, for example, we have our handy-dandy sandwich maker, and if you notice, a sandwich maker, it has the plastic outer component, but the part that comes into contact with the food is made of metal grates that are heated up through the electronic element underneath the grates, and the electronic and the metal component is the part that actually comes into contact and cooks the food. So this sandwich maker is, I don't know if they even make sandwich makers that are made by Jewish companies. Sometimes if you have electronic appliances, you can have, let me get my handy dandy Shabbos urn, right? Sometimes if you have electronic appliances, you can buy them from a kosher distributor, right? You can go to your local Judaica store, and you can buy your urn special for Shabbos, and it has your Shabbos mode and your Yontif mode, and it was produced also by Jewish companies. So these urns never actually were owned by a non-Jew. They were never actually owned by a non-Jew, so the requirement for tefillah never sets into place. So that type of electronic appliance, there's nothing to worry about, because just like any kli that does not belong to a non-Jew does not require tefillah, so too that sort of appliance would not either. However, but when it comes to a sandwich maker made by Sultan, fine company, when it comes to the sandwich maker, so this sandwich maker was produced in a regular factory. It was probably not owned by a Jew. Statistics would tell you that it's not owned by a Jew, and therefore it's a question, because there's a metal component that comes into contact with the food, does it require tefillah? So many poskim assume that it's like any other utensil. If the metal part comes into contact with the food, so then of course it requires to be immersed in a mikvah. Now we have a little bit of a dilemma, because when it comes to an electronic appliance, so we know very well that we do not like mixing electronic appliances and water. That can be, number one, dangerous, and number two, it can ruin the appliance. So many poskim have to deal with, what do you do in this sort of circumstances? So some poskim say, listen, we know that we don't want things to be wet when we're using them. Electronic appliances should not be used wet. So what do? You take it to the mikvah, put it into the mikvah, and then let it sit for a couple of weeks. If you let it sit for a couple of weeks, maybe blow it with a hairdryer, whatever you want to do, make sure it's nice and dry before your first use. If you let it sit for long enough, it will be dry before the first use, and it will have no harm. There will be no harm. It will not ruin the kli. The kli will fully dry, and you can use it without any problems. And many people have the practice of actually putting their electronic appliances into the mikvah and being told them before they end up using them, just making sure to be very careful to let them dry out fully and completely before the first usage. However, some poskim have determined that this process is still could be damaging to the kli. It might not be damaging immediately. It might reduce the lifespan of the kli in the long run, or even worse, unfortunately, in some circumstances, it might actually create hazards that would not be apparent in the immediate usage, but over time, because of erosion or other things, when it came into contact with the water, it could be that at a later time there are problems or issues that come up. I'm not an expert on electronic appliances, but there are poskim who have come to the conclusion that even if it's fully dried, it could still be an issue. It could still be a potential hazard or a potential shortening of the lifespan of the kli, in which case they've tried to come up with other alternative solutions to figure out how we can use our Keilim, our electronic appliances, if they do not go to the mikveh first. So there have been some very clever solutions to this problem. The Chelkas Yaakov was a very prominent posek, had come up with a solution that we mentioned that there's a difference between metal and earthenware. That metal is something that requires tefillah. It is subject to the rules of purity and impurity of tumah v'tahara. When it comes to earthenware or ceramics, since they are not subject to the rules of tumah v'tahara, so therefore they do not require tefillah. So Chelkas Yaakov explains that there's another type of thing that is not subject to the rules of tumah v'tahara, and that is something that is connected to the ground. If something is connected to the ground, it cannot become impure. So says the Chelkas Yaakov, how do you use an electronic appliance in most circumstances? It has a plug. Where do you plug it in? You plug it into the wall, in an outlet into the wall. When it's plugged into the outlet in the wall, so then it's connected to your house. Says the Chelkas Yaakov that because an electronic appliance cannot be used without plugging it in, so therefore its entire usage is by definition one where it is connected to your house, which is connected to the ground, which is mechubar lekarka, it is connected to the ground. So therefore, this utensil can also be considered something that is mechubar lekarka. It is something that's connected to the ground. Once it's connected to the ground, it is not subject to the rules of purity and impurity, and therefore it would not require tevilah, it would not require immersion in the mikvah. Many think that this is a clever solution, but this solution is not one that they would necessarily like to rely upon when it comes to their halacha l'maisa, their actual practice in their homes. So they've come up with other potential reasons to explain why an electronic appliance does not necessarily require tevilah. And again, some poskim accept these explanations and these suggestions, and some actually require tevilah the same way you would have to be tovel any of your other items. One other suggestion that is mentioned, Rav Shechter in Yeshiva University has a principle where he says that the Torah only required us, the Torah only gave us a mitzvah that is possible to perform. It says that usually tefillah is possible to perform. Sometimes it might be hard, sometimes the mikvah might be far away, sometimes it might be a little bit of a burden to take all of the Keilim and go to the mikvah, but it's possible to do. You do it with a little bit of sacrifice, it's possible to do. When it comes to an electronic appliance, says Rav Shechter, by definition, if you take the electronic appliance and you immerse it in the mikvah, the electronic appliance very likely will not work afterwards, or it's very possible that it will not work, or in the future it will not work. The actual action of tevilah, of the immersion, can ruin the utensil. Says Rav Shechter, if the actual act of tevilah by definition is going to ruin the utensil, so then that's not considered possible. That's not considered something that is efshar, that is possible to perform, and therefore the entire commandment could have never been given with regards to that sort of kli. Says Rav Shechter, because by definition it is not possible to perform the tevilah on an electronic appliance, the mitzvah never set into place, and there is no requirement to begin with to take the electronic kli to the mikvah and to perform the mitzvah of tevilas keilim with an electronic appliance. Again, some people accept this and some people do not. There is one other suggestion that has been discussed over the course of time that we mentioned, that the entire mitzvah of Tevilas Keilim is only one where the vessel has been taken or acquired from the possession of a non-Jew and then being brought into the possession of a Jewish ownership. So, for example, if you have something that is being borrowed from a non-Jew, if you have a kli that you're borrowing from a non-Jew, now obviously you have to make sure that it's kosher, that it has never been used for something that is not kosher, and that has no taste absorbed into it from non-kosher items. But if you borrow a utensil from a non-Jew, that is not actually considered to be under Jewish ownership. You're using it, but it's not yours. So because it's not yours, it still belongs to the non-Jewish owner. So therefore, there's no requirement to take that vessel to the mikvah before you use it after you've borrowed it. And there's no requirement whatsoever. So some have suggested that this is a potential solution. Now, it is true in the poskim that this solution of using a borrowed kli from a non-Jew without toveling it first, in order to help in a circumstance where you can't tovel a kli, is something that should only be done in an extenuating circumstance. So for example, if someone's on vacation and you have to buy a pot in order to cook dinner for your family, and there's no mikveh nearby, and there's no mikveh available, so you buy a pot from the store, but you can't tovel it. So what do? So one suggestion is, if you can give it to a non-Jewish friend, or have a non-Jewish friend pay for it, even if it's a small amount of money, that it becomes theirs, and then you utilize it, you use it as a borrowed kli from a non-Jew. There's no requirement for tevilah. Now, this is something that can work in an extenuating circumstance for a short period of time. That poskim are comfortable with. The question is, what about an electronic appliance? What if I sell my electronic appliance to my non-Jewish neighbor, and then I say to them, please you'll buy it for $1, and now it'll be yours, but I'll keep it in my kitchen and I'll borrow it on an indefinite basis, and I'll basically use it as if it were mine. So that would that allow us to say that this electronic appliance is really my non-Jewish neighbor's, and I'm just borrowing it, so I don't have to be tovel it? So is this an extenuating circumstance? So some folks can assume that because it would be ongoing forever like this, that can't be considered an extenuating circumstance. However, other folks can assume that because taking it to the mikvah and immersing it in the body of water would ruin the kli, so that is an extenuating circumstance. That is a shas hatak. What else am I going to do? I have no other choice. If I need to use this kli, I have no other choice but to immerse in the mikvah. Immersing in the mikvah is going to ruin it, so therefore I'm stuck. So what can I do? I can consider it an ongoing extenuating circumstance, such that I can sort of indefinitely borrow it from my non-Jewish neighbor, assuming that my non-Jewish neighbor pays, even if it's a small amount, to own this electronic appliance. So this is another suggestion that has been that has been put forth amongst different poskim, and this is something that some people rely upon. In terms of what to do with your particular electronic appliances in your own home, it's definitely a good idea to think about these different options and to discuss it with your local Orthodox rabbi. That's a big question when it comes to appliances. Now, there's another question that we should discuss and sometimes there's a little bit of a misconception surrounding this issue, is what about buying a kli from the store? You buy a new utensil. Can you use it once before taking it to the mikveh? Is there sort of a grace period before it has to go to the mikveh and be immersed? So many people have over the years been under the misconception for various reasons that you can use a kli one time before taking it to the mikveh. So the question is, why does this misconception exist? If you buy a kli and you take it back to your house, there definitely is not any on the books heter or allowance to use that kli once before taking it to the mikveh. It has to be taken to the mikveh before the first usage. However, there are some cases that resemble this type of scenario where it is permissible to use a kli without taking it to the mikveh, and this is a very famous position of Rav Moshe Feinstein that has to do with aluminum pans or aluminum tins, where these tins are made for only one-time use. So whereas if you buy a kli that is going to be used for a long period of time, of course you have to take it to the mikveh even before the first usage. But what if you have a kli which you're only going to use one time? So says Rav Moshe, if you're only going to use it one time, that does not have the status, the halachic status of a utensil, and therefore it does not require tevilah. It can be used one time and it then is thrown out. That does not require tevilah. That does not have to go to the mikveh. Some people may have assumed from this position that therefore if you have any utensil, if you have a pot, you have a pan, and you're going to take it to the mikveh, but you want to use it once before you go to the mikveh, that's okay. That is an incorrect application of this tshuva of Rav Moshe, but it is true that if you have an aluminum tin that you're only going to use once, and Rav Moshe even says, even if you're going to use it a couple of times, right? He doesn't exactly make it clear how many times is a couple of times, but even if you're going to use it a couple of times, says Rav Moshe, it would not require tevilah because it does not have the status of a utensil because it is disposable. This is also relevant for, say, a wine bottle, right? A wine bottle is a glass bottle. You buy it in the store, and unclear if it was produced by fully Jewish companies. Many wines are obviously owned by, many kosher wines are owned by Jewish companies, but it's unclear. The bottles are probably often produced off-site. So the bottles very likely could require tevilah, or a Snapple bottle that's made out of glass. Again, if it's made out of plastic, it's not a question. But if it's made out of glass, so then you get your bottle of wine, it's filled with its contents. So do you have to pour out all the contents before you use, and then take the bottle of wine to the mikveh, and then pour the wine back into the bottle in order to use it? So the poskim all assume that is not necessary, because since it already came in the bottle, it is, and you're pouring out the bottle, you're pouring out the wine, is considered passive usage of the kli. Passive usage of the kli does not require tevilah beforehand. And then once you spill out all the wine, once you use all the wine, you're going to throw out the bottle. So it doesn't take on the status of a kli, of a permanent kli that you're going to use that's going to require tevilah. So therefore, you can use this bottle of wine without taking it to the mikveh. However, if for some reason you would want to reuse the bottle, you would want to use it again, you would fill it up with some other liquid and you would store it in your kitchen, in your refrigerator. So then, at that point, the bottle would take on the status of a more permanent kli, and before reusing it, you would have to take it to the mikveh. So our half an hour is up. We were able to discuss some of the basic issues in terms of why we take things to the mikveh, how we actually perform the tevilah, and some of the details, some of an overview of the different halachos and different types of keilim, the different types of utensils that would require tevilah, some with a bracha and some without. There are definitely many other questions and many other issues in this very important mitzvah. However, our time is up, and I thank you all for joining us tonight for this edition of Myths and Facts. Thank you so much.